Right, as President Trump walks back tariffs on most products from Mexico and Canada again, Canada says retaliatory tariffs will stay in place until that pause is permanent.
Canada wasted no time in announcing a massive $760 billion plan to retaliate Trump's hefty tariffs, while the European Union rolled out a $40 billion tariff package of its own. This isn't just a few taxes on imported goods. This is shaping up to be a full-scale economic battle that could affect global markets in ways we haven't seen in years. The European Union took action almost immediately after the U.S. move. With American steel and aluminum producers getting a competitive edge from the tariffs, European leaders decided they wouldn't just sit back and let their industries take the hit. They imposed their own counter tariffs on a range of U.S. products, worth about 26 billion euros, or roughly $28 billion. What kinds of products are getting taxed? Everything from industrial machinery and car parts to agricultural goods like fruits, vegetables, and wine. This wasn't just about targeting random industries. It was a direct move to hit American exports where it would hurt the most. But the EU wasn't alone. Canada, another country deeply affected by the U.S. tariffs, came out swinging with its own set of countermeasures. The Canadian government imposed retaliatory duties on over 2,800 U.S. products, covering everything from Levi's jeans and whiskey to Boeing aircraft. This wasn't just a symbolic move. Canadian officials made it clear they were ready to make the trade war as painful as possible for American industries. With U.S. exports facing rising costs and new barriers, businesses across multiple sectors, particularly agriculture and manufacturing, were suddenly looking at a much more uncertain future. American companies, especially those in agriculture, are feeling the heat. Many farmers rely on international markets to sell their crops, and these tariffs are making their products more expensive and less attractive to foreign buyers. The whiskey industry is also under fire, with Kentucky's bourbon producers now struggling as the EU slaps additional tariffs on American-made spirits. And it's not just small businesses. Some of the biggest brands in the U.S. are starting to feel the effects of these trade battles. Harley-Davidson, for example, has already seen its costs rise due to European tariffs, which could force the company to raise prices or even move some production overseas. One of the biggest concerns is what this means for overall trade between the US, Canada, and the EU. For years, these economies have worked closely together, benefiting from relatively free trade. Now, with each country retaliating against new tariffs, the entire system is at risk of unraveling. Since the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the EU took effect, trade between the two regions has grown by 7%. Canadian businesses have started to shift their focus away from the US, looking instead toward Europe and Asia for new opportunities. This shift is a big deal. Canada has long been heavily dependent on trade with the US, but with tensions rising, businesses are making moves to reduce that reliance. More companies are exploring European markets, taking advantage of trade agreements that offer them better terms than they might get from the US. And it's not just businesses making these moves. Consumers in Canada are also starting to change their shopping habits. There's been a noticeable increase in people looking for alternatives to American products, choosing Canadian or European brands instead. As tensions escalate, the big question is whether these trade battles will spiral out of control. The U.S. decision to raise tariffs was meant to protect American industries, but in reality, it's triggering a wave of retaliation that could end up doing more harm than good. Countries like Canada and the EU aren't just rolling over, they're actively finding ways to minimize their dependence on the U.S. economy. If this trend continues, American businesses could find themselves locked out of key markets, with fewer buyers for their goods and higher costs across the board. The consequences are already showing up in stock markets. Investors don't like uncertainty, and every new round of tariffs adds another layer of instability. After Trump's initial announcement, the S&P 500 dropped by 0.8% within hours, and companies and industries affected by the tariffs saw even steeper declines. Steel and aluminum prices have jumped, pushing up costs for American manufacturers who rely on these materials. Car makers in particular are facing a serious challenge. Companies like Ford, GM, and Tesla have all had to rethink their supply chains as the cost of materials goes up. So what happens next? Will the U.S. back down in the face of mounting pressure from its trading partners, or will it double down and escalate things even further? And if countries like Canada and the EU continue moving away from American trade, how will that reshape the global economy in the long run? One of Canada's most aggressive moves was its decision to impose a surcharge on electricity exports to the the U.S. This is not a small retaliation. This is a direct hit on a critical resource that millions of Americans rely on. Nearly 1.5 million households in states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota are expected to feel the effects of these rising costs. For years, Ontario and Quebec have been major electricity suppliers to the U.S., especially through hydroelectric power. Now, with Canada imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports, prices for American consumers are expected to rise sharply, and businesses that rely on cheap energy could struggle to maintain production costs. But Canada didn't stop there. In another bold move, British Columbia quickly enforced new measures designed to make life difficult for American businesses. U.S. trucks traveling through BC to Alaska are now facing road tolls and tighter regulations, making it more expensive and complicated for American freight companies to operate in the region. Canada has also tightened its import rules on essential goods like fuel, food, and consumer products from the U.S., creating new barriers for American exports. Other provinces have joined in as well. Nova Scotia has banned U.S. businesses from bidding on government contracts, while Manitoba and Newfoundland have completely removed American-made products from state-run retail stores. These moves are clearly designed to send a message: if the U.S. is going to raise tariffs, Canada is more than willing to fight back with its own economic weapons. The question is, how much damage will these measures cause? U.S. freight companies that depend on Canadian routes are already reporting severe disruptions. Goods that once moved smoothly across the border are now facing delays, higher costs, and new restrictions. American businesses that rely on exports to Canada are also struggling as Canadian buyers begin shifting their purchases to alternative markets. In some industries, especially agriculture, this could mean significant financial losses for U.S. farmers and producers. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of this trade war is how quickly Canada has begun breaking away from economic reliance on the U.S. Instead of waiting for Washington to change its policies, Canadian officials are working aggressively to expand trade with other regions. The European Union has emerged as a key partner, with Canadian exports to Europe rising by 7% since the implementation of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. This is not just a short-term shift. Canada is actively working to diversify its economy and reduce its dependence on U.S. trade altogether. For American businesses, this is a major problem. Canada has historically been one of the United States' biggest trading partners, with billions of dollars in goods moving between the two countries every year. If Canada continues redirecting its trade toward Europe and Asia, American companies could face long-term losses and reduced access to one of their most important markets. The financial markets are already reacting to these tensions. The S&P 500 dropped 0.8% within hours of Trump's tariff announcement, with major manufacturers seeing even steeper declines. The auto industry in particular is taking a serious hit. Ford, GM, and Tesla are all scrambling to adjust their supply chains as the cost of materials rises. Steel and aluminum prices have surged, making it more expensive to produce cars, buildings, and other essential products. If prices keep climbing, American consumers could soon see the effects in the form of higher costs for vehicles, appliances, and even basic household goods. While Canada is retaliating aggressively, U.S. officials have made it clear that they are not backing down. The Trump administration has issued a warning. If Canada does not remove its new trade barriers, the U.S. could impose even higher tariffs on Canadian car imports. This would be a devastating blow to Canada's auto industry, which is already under pressure from rising steel prices. But Canada is not waiting to see what happens next. The government has already begun preparing for further economic retaliation by investing in alternative markets and trade agreements. There is a growing sense that this trade war is not just a temporary dispute, but a sign of deeper economic realignment. The Canadian government is making it clear that it is willing to absorb short-term losses in order to gain long-term independence from the U.S. economy. One of the most significant consequences of this trade war is the shift in public opinion. Canadian consumers are now more motivated than ever to support local businesses and avoid American products. Online searches for Canadian-made goods have surged, and retailers are beginning to promote non-U.S. brands more aggressively. This kind of consumer shift is hard to reverse. Once people develop new shopping habits, they rarely go back. If this trend continues, American businesses could see their market share in Canada shrink permanently. Beyond economic losses, there are political implications as well. In Canada, the trade war has sparked a wave of nationalism, with citizens rallying behind their government's tough stance against the U.S. Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney has seen his approval ratings rise as Canadians unite in support of retaliatory measures. For years, Canada has maintained a relatively peaceful and cooperative relationship with the U.S., but this trade dispute is changing that dynamic in a way that could last for generations. So where does this leave the United States? On one hand, the tariffs are achieving their intended goal of making American steel and aluminum more competitive within the domestic market. But on the other hand, the cost of these policies is becoming increasingly clear. Trade partners like Canada and the EU are not just imposing counter tariffs, they are actively working to distance themselves from the U.S. economy. This could be the start of a much larger shift in global trade. If more countries follow Canada's lead and start reducing their reliance on U.S. imports, America could find itself facing a long-term decline in economic influence. The trade war may have started with steel and aluminum, but the effects are spreading far beyond those industries. The big question now is whether the U.S. government will hold its ground or attempt to de-escalate the situation. If tensions continue to rise, both sides will face increasing pressure to find a resolution before the economic damage becomes too severe. However, with both countries deeply entrenched in their positions, a quick resolution seems unlikely. For now, all eyes are on the next moves from Washington and Ottawa. Will the U.S. push forward with even more tariffs? Will Canada continue cutting ties with American businesses? And most importantly, how will this growing economic conflict impact everyday people on both sides of the border? While the trade war between the U.S. and Canada is grabbing most of the headlines, another key player in North America is carefully weighing its next move. Mexico, one of the United States' largest trade partners, has taken a more measured approach, choosing negotiation over immediate retaliation. But that doesn't mean Mexico is powerless in this situation. In fact, if tensions continue to rise, Mexico could deliver some of the strongest economic blows to the U.S., particularly in energy and automotive supply chains. For years, Mexico has been a crucial supplier of crude oil to the U.S., accounting for about 8 to 10% of total American oil imports. Over 1 million barrels of oil per day flow through pipelines between the two countries, feeding refineries in Texas, California, and beyond. If Mexico were to cut or reduce this supply, the effects would be felt almost immediately. Fuel prices in the U.S. would spike, adding to inflationary pressures that are already hitting American consumers. The disruption could also impact industries that rely on steady energy supplies, from transportation to manufacturing. But oil is just one part of the equation. The U.S. auto industry is deeply intertwined with Mexico's manufacturing sector. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler rely heavily on Mexican factories for auto parts and assembly. Many vehicles sold in the U.S. are built using components that cross the border multiple times before they reach dealerships. If Mexico were to impose tariffs or disrupt this supply chain, the impact on American automakers would be immediate and severe. Higher production costs would lead to more expensive cars for consumers, and in an already competitive market, that could result in lower sales and potential job losses in the U.S. auto sector. So far, Mexico has opted for patience. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has prioritized diplomacy over retaliation, emphasizing negotiation as the best path forward. However, that doesn't mean Mexico is unprepared to act. The Mexican government has made it clear that if the U.S. continues down this path, they will have no choice but to respond. One of the biggest potential targets is U.S. agricultural products, particularly corn, soybeans, and beef, major exports that American farmers rely on. If Mexico imposes tariffs or restrictions on these goods, it would put even more pressure on an industry already struggling with the fallout of the U.S.-Canada trade war. Beyond tariffs, Mexico could also take other steps to limit American economic influence. One idea being floated is to blacklist certain U.S. companies, making it harder for them to operate in Mexico. This would be a major blow to American corporations that have benefited from cheap labor and tax incentives south of the border. With Mexico serving as a major hub for U.S. manufacturers, any disruption in this relationship could have wide-ranging consequences. As tensions rise, there is growing pressure for leaders on both sides to find a resolution. Mexico's President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum is taking a proactive approach, seeking direct talks with the U.S. before any retaliatory measures are implemented. She is expected to have a phone call with U.S. officials to discuss potential solutions and explore ways to prevent the situation from escalating further. While she has stated that Mexico does not want a trade war, she has also made it clear that her country will not stand by and allow its economy to be damaged by American tariffs. If negotiations fail, Mexico has set a deadline for March 9th, at which point retaliatory measures will be announced. This looming deadline adds another layer of uncertainty to the already unstable trade situation in North America. If Mexico does decide to impose counter tariffs or take other measures, it could push the U.S. into an even deeper economic conflict with its neighbors. The North American supply chain is heavily interconnected, and a full-scale trade war could disrupt industries in ways that are difficult to predict. Meanwhile, Canada continues to ramp up its own efforts to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. Canadian leaders have recognized that this trade war isn't just a temporary dispute, it's a wake-up call. Over the past few decades, Canada has relied heavily on the U.S. for trade, but now it is aggressively seeking new economic partners. The European Union has become a key ally, with trade between Canada and the EU increasing steadily under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. Canadian businesses are also making major shifts. Companies that once exported primarily to the US are now expanding into European and Asian markets. The Canadian government is working to make this transition easier by securing new trade agreements and providing financial incentives for businesses to diversify their exports. This isn't just about avoiding tariffs. It's about long-term economic security. The less Canada relies on the U.S., the less vulnerable it will be to future trade disputes. One of the most surprising developments in this trade war is the way Canada has turned its energy sector into a strategic tool. For years, Canada has been one of the largest suppliers of oil, gas, and electricity to the U.S. In 2023 alone, Canada provided over 50% of America's imported oil. But now, Canada is exploring new opportunities, exporting more of its energy resources to Asia instead of the U.S. Countries like Japan and South Korea are beginning to purchase Canadian oil and gas, reducing their dependence on Middle Eastern suppliers. The expansion of Canada's Trans Mountain Pipeline is a key part of this strategy. With new infrastructure in place, Canada is no longer as reliant on the U.S. as a buyer for its energy exports. Instead, it is building stronger trade relationships with Asian markets, which are willing to pay a higher price for Canadian oil. This shift could leave the U.S. facing an unstable energy supply in the future, especially if tensions continue to grow between the two nations. At the same time, the political landscape in Canada is shifting. The trade war has ignited a wave of nationalism, with Canadians rallying around their government's tough stance against U.S. policies. Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney has seen a surge in support, as citizens appreciate the government's efforts to stand up to economic pressure from Washington. This kind of political unity is rare, and it suggests that even if the U.S. reverses its tariffs, Canada may continue its push for economic independence. For American consumers, the consequences of this trade war are becoming more apparent. Prices on goods like cars, appliances, and food are expected to rise as tariffs increase production costs. At the same time, American companies are losing access to key markets as Canada, Mexico, and the EU impose their own restrictions. What was supposed to be a strategy to protect American industries is now backfiring, with the global economy shifting in ways that could hurt the U.S. in the long run. The question now is whether this trade war will continue escalating, or if leaders will step back before the damage becomes irreversible. The coming weeks will be critical. If the U.S. remains firm on its tariffs, we could see further retaliation from Canada and Mexico, along with more countries joining in the fight. But if negotiations are successful, there may still be a chance to prevent a full-scale economic crisis. Regardless of how this plays out, one thing is clear: North American trade relations will never be the same again. Canada and Mexico are proving that they are not dependent on the U.S., and they are actively working to build stronger ties with other markets. The decisions made now will shape the future of trade in the region for years to come.